The door of Aaron Archer's cabin flew open with a violence that sent splinters raking across the pine floor, and when he stepped inside from the freezing Colorado night air, every single thing he had built his solitary life around shattered in the space of one breath. She was there. A woman, a stranger, sat at his table, wrapped in his elk-hide blanket, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, her hands curled around his tin coffee mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. The fire he had stoked before dawn still crackled in the hearth. His lantern was lit. His bread, the loaf he had left cooling, was half-eaten on the board beside her. She had broken the one rule he had posted on the door of this cabin in letters burned deep into a pine plank for 14 years. 3 words, plain as judgment. No one enters. Aaron stood in the doorway with 6 inches of December snow on his boots and a rifle in his hand and stared at her. The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were the color of a storm coming across the high plains, gray shot through with dark blue. And she did not flinch, not even when she saw the rifle, not even when she saw the expression on his face that every man in 3 mountain counties knew meant something unspeakable was about to happen. She said, in a voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion, "I know what that sign says. I read it before I came inside. I came inside anyway." Aaron had not spoken to a woman in 2 years. He had not let a living soul into this cabin in 4. He had built this place with his own 2 hands on a ridge above Crested Butte, Colorado, in the year of our Lord 1878, and the rule on the door had been the first thing he had made after the last wall went up. The rule was not about property or pride. It was about something far older and far darker than either. It was about survival, his survival of a kind that had nothing to do with mountain lions or blizzards. He said nothing. He just stared at her. She reached up and pushed the wet hair from her face, and he saw then what he had missed in the first shock of seeing her. The bruise across her left cheekbone, dark purple fading to sickly green at the edges, the split along her lower lip, the way she held her left arm close to her body as though the shoulder had been wrenched hard enough to loosen something vital. She had not broken into his cabin out of curiosity. She had broken in because she was running from something, and whatever it was had already put its hands on her. Aaron Archer closed the door behind him. He set the rifle against the wall. He said absolutely nothing and walked to the fire and held his hands out to the flame. And for a long moment the only sound in the world was the pop of pine sap and the wind pushing hard against the shuttered windows, and the slow, careful breathing of a man who was trying to remember who he had been before the rule and who he had become because of it, and whether any of that still mattered now. It had begun, as most disasters do in the ordinary way, on an ordinary day, almost 3 weeks before. The last stage into Crested Butte before the December closure of the mountain passes came rattling down from Gunnison on the 4th of December, 1882, carrying a mail sack, 2 barrels of lamp oil, a crate of medical supplies for the mining company doctor, and 1 passenger. Julia Garrison stepped off the stage onto the frozen mud of the main street with a leather traveling trunk that was clearly too heavy for her, a carpetbag that was clearly too light given how long she intended to stay, and the expression of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is stronger than she looks and has only recently, and at great cost, discovered that to be true. She was 26 years old. She was 5'5" and lean in the way that came from hard work rather than scarcity, with the kind of face that made people look twice not because it was conventionally beautiful, though it was, but because it was fiercely, conspicuously alive. Every emotion she felt crossed her features without apology, which had been both her greatest gift and, according to her recently deceased husband, her greatest flaw. Her recently deceased husband, Robert Garrison, had told her a great many things about her flaws in the 4 years of their marriage. Most of them were delivered with the back of his hand. The last one had been delivered on the floor of their Denver home on a Tuesday morning in October when Julia had finally picked up the iron poker from the fireplace and swung it at the man who was trying to kick in her ribs while she lay on the floor. She had not killed him. She had wanted to. She had put him in the hospital for 6 days, which had given her enough time to empty the bank account she had built from her own seamstress money, pack the leather trunk, buy a stage ticket, and get as far from Denver as the last mountain pass of the season would carry her, which had delivered her here, to Crested Butte, Colorado. Population 412, mostly miners, mostly male, mostly rough, and almost entirely uninterested in a woman arriving alone with a bruised face, and a story she was not yet ready to tell. She had the name of a woman, a Mrs. Clara Holt, who ran the only boarding house in town, given to her by a church acquaintance in Denver who had described Crested Butte as the kind of place a person can disappear into if they need to. Julia had needed to. She needed to still. She found Mrs. Holt's boarding house on the north end of the main street, a 2-story frame building with a painted sign and a porch that needed attention. Mrs. Holt herself was a compact, gray-haired widow of 60 with eyes that missed nothing and a policy of minding her own business so comprehensively that it had become its own form of wisdom. She took one look at Julia Garrison's face and said, $1.50 a week, meals included. You start paying when you start working. I need help with the kitchen and the laundry. Julia said, "Yes, ma'am," and carried her trunk up the stairs herself. She settled into the rhythm of the boarding house quickly. She was good with her hands, she could cook and she could sew, and she could carry a loaded laundry basket up a flight of stairs without complaint. And within a week she had made herself indispensable to Clara Holt in the quiet, efficient way that some people have, where they do not announce their worth but simply demonstrate it so consistently that its absence would be immediately catastrophic. She also began, cautiously, to take the measure of Crested Butte. It was a mining town, active and rough, with the big mine up the canyon pulling silver and coal out of the mountain with the relentless appetite of machinery and men. The main street had a general store run by a man named Elias Webb, a saloon called the Silver Horn, a bank, a telegraph office, and the mining company office. There was a church that was also a school when the itinerant preacher was not in it. The men were mostly decent in the way that men who work hard and live hard tend to be blunt, practical, a little clumsy with courtesy, but not unkind. A few of them were not decent at all, but Julia Garrison had developed, over 4 years of marriage to Robert, a sharp and accurate instinct for which category a man fell into, and she trusted that instinct now the way she had not been willing to trust it before. She heard about Aaron Archer for the first time on her 5th day in Crested Butte, from the general storekeeper, Elias Webb, who was a garrulous man in the best possible way, and who considered the conveyance of local knowledge to newcomers a civic duty. She had come in for needle and thread. She was mending sheets for Clara Holt, and Elias, while wrapping her purchase, had launched into an unprompted survey of the surrounding homesteads and their occupants, clearly because he enjoyed it, and because Julia had the kind of attentive face that invited monologue. "Up on the North Ridge," Elias said, "about 4 miles out past the creek crossing, there is a cabin that belongs to Aaron Archer. Trapper mostly, some hunting. Does work for the mining company in summer, fixing equipment, that sort of thing. Man is capable of extraordinary things with his hands, built that cabin himself, made half his own furniture, and the company engineer says Archer understands machinery the way most men understand horses. But you won't find him in town much. Maybe once a month he comes in for supplies. He does not stop in the saloon. He does not attend church. He nods at people, but he does not generally speak unless he needs to," Julia said. "Sounds like a man who values his privacy." Elias said, "That is a generous way of putting it. There are other ways. The cabin has a sign on the door, is what I'm telling you. 3 words. He put it up when he built the place and it has never come down. The man is not dangerous. I want to be clear about that, but he is alone by choice, and the choice is not casual." Julia said, "What happened to him?" Elias paused in his wrapping. He looked at her with a kind of measured respect, as though she had identified the right question faster than he had expected. Then he said, "That is the question the whole of Crested Butte has been asking for 4 years. Nobody has a complete answer. There are pieces." His wife died, people say back wherever he came from, which might be Wyoming or might be further east. Nobody knows for certain. Something else happened too, something before that or alongside it, something that made the loneliness into a decision rather than just a circumstance. But Archer doesn't tell it, and the sign on the door says more than he's ever said out loud. Julia took her needle and thread and went back to Clara Holt's boarding house and thought about Aaron Archer for exactly as long as it took her to thread her needle. And then she put him out of her mind entirely, because she had enough complexity in her own life without borrowing someone else's. She did not think about him again for another 9 days. On the 14th of December, Robert Garrison arrived in Crested Butte on foot, having been let off a freight wagon 2 miles south of town when the wagon's axle cracked on the ice. He had walked the rest of the way in boots that were not made for mountain winter, and by the time he reached the main street, he was furious in the cold, deliberate way that Julia had learned to fear far more than his explosive anger. Because the cold fury meant he had been planning, and Robert Garrison was a clever man when he planned. He was 34 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a handsome face that had fooled Julia when she was 22 and naive enough to mistake confidence for character. He had a badge pinned to his coat, a deputy sheriff's badge from a Denver suburb, which was, Julia knew, partly legitimate and entirely a tool for intimidation. He walked into Clara Holt's boarding house and asked for Julia Garrison in the tone of a man who expected no resistance to anything he asked for ever. Clara Holt looked at him for 3 seconds and said she had no guest by that name. Robert smiled at her and said he was going to look around anyway. He found Julia's room on the 2nd floor. He found her trunk. He did not find Julia because Clara Holt had seen him coming through her parlor window. The woman had instincts developed over 60 years of navigating the world as a woman alone, and she had sent her kitchen boy to find Julia with a whispered message. "Do not come back to the house right now." Julia had been at the general store. She heard the message and felt the old terror move through her like floodwater under ice, cold and unstoppable and carrying things that could break bones. She looked at Elia's web and said, "My husband is here." She said it very quietly, in the tone a person uses when saying a fact that is also a sentence of some kind. Elias Webb looked at her face. The bruise was faded but not gone, and he understood the complete picture in about 4 seconds. He was a decent man, he said. "Is there somewhere you can go that is not the boarding house?" Julia said, "I don't know this town well enough." Elias said, "I know it well enough for both of us. There are options. The saloon, but Garrison will check there. The mine office, but it's Friday and there will be men leaving for the weekend. The church, but the door is not locked and there is only one room." He paused. He was thinking. Then he said, with the particular look of a man who is proposing something that he himself would not do and is aware of that fact, "There is Aaron Archer's cabin." Julia said, "The man with the sign." Elias said, "The man with the sign. He comes to town today, Fridays, last of the month or when the weather's closing in, and the weather is closing in. He should be here within the hour. You could ride back up with him. He has a room he uses for storing hides. It is not comfortable, but it is private, and your husband, or whoever that man is, would never find you there because nobody in town will tell him Archer exists unless they have a specific reason to." Julia was quiet for a long moment. The terror of Robert finding her pressed against her ribs like a hand. She thought about the sign on the door of the cabin. She thought about the man who had put it there. She said, "I can't ask a stranger to involve himself in my trouble." Elias said, "You are right that you probably can't ask him, but you can put yourself in his path and see what happens. Aaron Archer has his rules, but he has something older than rules too. I have seen it operate once or twice." She waited for Aaron Archer. He came into the store an hour later, a tall man, 6'2", broad through the shoulders with the kind of lean that came from actual physical work rather than careful eating, with dark brown hair going a little gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same material as the mountains. He was 34 years old, Julia would learn later, which put them exactly the same age. He wore a canvas coat over a flannel shirt, and he moved with the economy of motion that belongs to people who live alone in places where efficiency matters. He came into the store and stopped when he saw Julia Garrison, because Elias had strategically arranged the space so that stopping was the natural thing to do. Elias said, "Aaron, this is Julia Garrison. She is staying at Clara Holt's place. She is in some difficulty and I think you might be in a position to help." Aaron Archer looked at Elias with the expression of a man who has been set up and knows it, and is weighing the social cost of acknowledging that fact versus the simpler cost of just dealing with whatever the setup involves. He looked at Julia. She looked back at him. She did not flinch and she did not perform distress. She just looked at him with those gray-blue eyes and said, "There is a man in this town looking for me. He is my husband and he has been hurting me for 4 years and I left him in October and he found me. I need somewhere to be for a day or two while I figure out what to do next. I heard about your cabin. I know about your rule. I'm not asking you to break your rule. I am asking if there is another option you might know of." Aaron was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Elias started to look uncomfortable. Then he said, "What is your husband's name?" "Robert Garrison. He has a deputy's badge from Denver." Aaron said, "Is the badge real?" "Real enough to cause trouble in a town that doesn't know him." Aaron looked out the store window at the sky, which was doing the particular thing that Colorado mountain skies do in December when a storm is coming, the light going flat and hard and yellow at the edges. He said, "Storm's coming in by tonight. Stage Road will be closed by morning. He won't be able to leave even if he wants to." He paused. "He won't be able to follow either." He looked at Julia for a moment, and she could see something working in him that was not simple calculation. That was older and more complicated and possibly more dangerous for both of them than anything she had said out loud. He said, "Get your things from Clara Holt's. Meet me at the livery in 40 minutes. I will have a horse for you." He went and did his shopping and did not say another word to her, and she went and retrieved her carpetbag. She left the trunk because she could not carry it quickly, and because leaving it behind made her feel, oddly, as though she was not fully committing to a plan she was already afraid of. And she slipped out the back of Clara Holt's boarding house, while Clara kept Robert Garrison occupied in the parlor with a story about the town council and the need for his professional opinion on a municipal matter, which was so clearly invented that it would only work on a man whose vanity about his own authority exceeded his intelligence, which Robert's did, barely. At the livery, Aaron Archer had a gray mare saddled and ready for her, and he was already mounted on a dark bay with the easy posture of a man who has been putting horses through hard country for years. He looked at her carpetbag and said nothing about the trunk. They rode out of town in the dying afternoon light without speaking. The trail north out of Crested Butte climbed fast into the trees, lodgepole pine and aspen, the aspen stripped bare in December, and the pine heavy with last week's snow. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes as they gained elevation, and Julia rode with her jaw set against the cold and watched Aaron Archer's back and thought about the sign on the door and what it would mean to arrive at the door of a man who had built his loneliness as deliberately as he had built his cabin. They reached the creek crossing after an hour and a half of riding, and by then the first snow of the storm was beginning to fall, light flakes at first, tentative, and then with more conviction, the way things gather themselves in the mountains. Aaron crossed the creek on a ford of flat stones and looked back to make sure Julia's mare managed the crossing, and Julia noticed that he did this without making it obvious. The way a person checks on another person when they do not want the other person to know they are being checked on. The cabin was another 40 minutes above the creek. It sat on a long shelf of rock that jutted from the north ridge like a natural platform, surrounded by old-growth pine on 3 sides and open on the south face with a view down the valley that, even in the closing dark and the building snow, was enough to stop the breath. It was built of hand-notched logs, tight at the joints, with a stone chimney already putting out smoke because Aaron had banked the fire before he left and it had held. There were good solid shutters on all the windows, closed now. A woodpile under a lean-to at the east end of the cabin that was stacked with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of a man who understood exactly what winter meant at this elevation. And on the door in letters that had been burned deeply enough to last, "No one enters." Julia read it from horseback and said nothing about it. Aaron dismounted, tied both horses at the rail, and turned to her with his hand out to take her saddlebag. She handed it over and said, "Thank you for this." He said, "You are not inside yet," and he said it without particular warmth but also without cruelty, like a statement of fact, like a man reminding himself of something as much as telling her something. He opened the door and stood back, and after a moment Julia Garrison walked through it. The interior of the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, accessed by a ladder. The main floor had a stone hearth, a heavy pine table, 2 chairs, a workbench along the east wall with tools arranged in rows of ascending size, a gun rack with 3 rifles and a shotgun, a canned goods shelf, a dry goods cupboard, and a braided rug in front of the fire that looked as though it had been made by hand from strips of old canvas and wool. The ceiling was low and hung with dried herbs and a brace of last month's grouse. It smelled of pine smoke and coffee and beeswax, and something underneath that was uniquely and specifically a man who lived alone in high country wood smoke worked deep into fabric, the faint musk of animal pelts, the cold clean air of altitude. It was not luxurious. It was not comfortable in the way that hotels or boarding houses were comfortable. But it was so completely, carefully constructed, every element serving a purpose, every item in its place with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the logic of solo living, that it had a quality Julia could only call austere beauty. Like a psalm, like a mathematical proof, like something that worked so perfectly it had become, almost despite itself, an art form. Aaron built the fire back up and put coffee on the hook and went back out to tend the horses. Julia stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. When he came back, he said, "Loft is for sleeping. There is a partition curtain up there. You will take the east side, I will take the west." Julia said, "Where do you usually sleep?" He said, "The west side." She said, "Then I will sleep wherever you do not." He said, "That is what I said." There was a pause. He poured 2 mugs of coffee from the pot and set one on the table near her, and kept one in his own hand and stood with his back to the fire, and the light made his face into something that was not quite as hard as it looked in the gray daylight of town. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that might have been from squinting into mountain light, or might have been from something else entirely, something older and deeper, and the set of his mouth was not severe so much as carefully controlled. The way a door is not locked so much as held shut by a hand that has been holding it for a very long time. He said, "Tell me about your husband." It was not an invitation so much as a practical request. Julia understood he needed information about the threat, the way you needed information about weather or terrain. She told him. Not everything, not the worst of it, not the specifics that still made her hands shake if she let herself go near them, but enough. The 4 years. The pattern of it, the October morning, the hospital, the flight. The fact that Robert had resources and connections, and the badge and the patient, cold fury that made him more dangerous than a man who simply raged. Aaron listened without interruption and without the expressions that people sometimes made, the horror, the pity, the discomfort, that she had found in the few times she had told pieces of this story, made her feel that her suffering was somehow inconvenient for the listener. He just listened, with his dark eyes steady on her face, and when she finished he said, "Does he know where you went specifically, or just that you came this direction?" She said, "He knows I took the stage from Denver." He knows the stage came here. But I told no one in Denver where I was going, and I had not written to Clara Holt in advance. I simply appeared. So unless someone in town told him, he does not know about me specifically being at Clara Holt's. Aaron said, Clara won't tell him. Julia said, Elias Webb. Aaron said, Elias brought you to me. He will not tell a man with a badge anything about you. She said, how can you be sure? He looked at her with something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a very small smile. He said, because Elias Webb lost his first wife to a man who hit her. He does not talk about it, and he does not make it obvious, but it is the governing fact of his life. He has been waiting 14 years for an occasion to act on it, and I think today he found one. Julia was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she said, you all know each other very well for a town of 400 people. Aaron said, 400 people and 400 miles of mountain in every direction. You learn the essential things about each other, or you don't survive the winters. She went up to the loft and slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in months, with the sound of the blizzard working itself up outside and the warmth of the fire below, and the knowledge that the partition curtain 4 feet away was the only thing between her and a man who had, with minimal ceremony and considerable personal cost, chosen to bring her here. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of whiteout conditions above the creek crossing, of wind that pressed against the cabin walls with a force that was almost conversational in its insistence, of temperatures that dropped far enough at night that the coffee left in the pot froze solid. 3 days in which Julia Garrison and Aaron Archer shared an 800-square-foot space, and the particular intimacy of being completely snowbound with another human being. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most revealing experiences of Julia's life. She learned that Aaron woke before dawn every single morning without apparent effort, dressed in the dark with a quietness that was almost supernatural, and was at the fire with coffee on before the light came. She learned that he was not silent so much as economical with words. When he spoke, the words did specific work, and when they did not need to work, he was quiet. But the quiet was not the aggressive, punishing silence of a man trying to make a woman feel small. It was the natural quiet of someone who had spent years with only himself for company and had made peace with the quality of that company. She learned that he could fix anything. On the first storm day, a hinge on the east shutter worked loose, and the wind found the gap immediately with tremendous enthusiasm, and Aaron had the shutter rehung in 20 minutes with tools he found by feel in the dark of the tool shelf. He patched a section of chimney mortar that had developed a crack. He relaced a snowshoe that had been sitting in the corner waiting for the repair. He also read. She had not expected that. There was a shelf above the workbench with maybe 30 books on it, well-read books, the spines cracked and the pages soft from handling, and she stood in front of it on the first afternoon while the storm raged outside and read the titles. Darwin, Emerson, Thoreau naturally, a collected Shakespeare, 3 geology texts, a history of the Roman Empire, 2 novels by Charles Dickens, both battered past their covers into something purely architectural, held together by their own internal logic. She took down Dickens' Great Expectations and sat in the chair near the fire and read, and when she looked up an hour later, Aaron was at the table with a geology text open, and they were reading in the same space, in the same firelight, with the blizzard making its argument outside, and it felt so unexpectedly, powerfully right that Julia had to look back down at her page quickly before he could see whatever had crossed her face. On the second day of the storm, she asked him directly what had happened to bring him here. She had not planned to ask. She was at the work table, mending a tear in her coat sleeve with the needle and thread she had bought at Elia's store, and Aaron was currying a hide at the far end of the table, and the storm had settled into a sustained low note outside that was almost meditative, and she said, "You do not have to tell me, but I told you mine." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to decline. Then he said, "My wife's name was Margaret. We were in Wyoming, Laramie. I was working as a surveyor for the railroad. We had a house, a life, the beginning of something that looked like it was going to be what you plan on when you are young enough to still believe in plans. He paused, set the hide aside, put his hands flat on the table and looked at them as though they were capable of explaining something he could not quite articulate. There was a man named Frank Dewey who worked for the same railroad company. He had a history that neither the company nor I knew about at the time, a history of taking things that belonged to other people and convincing himself and everyone around him that the taking was justified. He decided that my wife belonged to him. Margaret did not agree. She told me about his attention, about how it made her feel watched and frightened, and I went to the railroad company and the company said they could not act on a domestic matter, so I went to Frank Dewey directly. His jaw tightened. Julia stopped sewing. He told me that Margaret was wrong about his intentions. He was very smooth about it, very plausible, and God help me, I believed enough of it to go home and tell Margaret that she might have misread the situation. I believed him over her, and she looked at me when I told her that, and I have never in my life seen someone look at me the way she did in that moment. Not angry, just very, very tired. He was quiet again. The fire snapped. 3 weeks later, Frank Dewey came to the house while I was on a survey 40 miles out. She was alone. She fought him. There was evidence of that later. She fought very hard. He stopped, started again. She died. The word fell into the room like a stone into water. Julia did not speak. Dewey left Wyoming that same night. The railroad company said they had no knowledge of his whereabouts. The town marshal, who was friends with the company's operations manager, investigated for 2 weeks and found nothing substantial, which was either incompetence or deliberate. Either way, there was no trial, no conviction, no consequence. Just a grave on a hill outside Laramie and a surveyor who had believed the wrong person. He picked the hide back up. His hands were steady. His face was the carefully closed thing that Julia now understood was not coldness but the management of something enormous. He said, "The cabin was the answer to several questions at once. The sign on the door was the answer to the question I was most afraid of, which was whether I was capable of protecting anyone. I decided I was not. So I decided to ensure the situation would never arise again." Julia Garrison set down her sewing. She looked at him for a long time. She wanted to say many things. She said one. "You brought me here." He said, "Yes." She said, "That broke your rule before I even arrived." He said, very quietly, "Yes, it did." Something shifted between them in that moment, not dramatically, not with the sudden clarion quality of romance novels, but the way weight shifts on a bridge when a second person steps onto it, and the whole structure adjusts, and the adjustment is so fundamental that neither person mentions it but both feel it in the soles of their feet. On the 3rd day of the storm, Julia woke before Aaron for the first time. She came down the loft ladder in the 4 in the morning dark and built the fire up from the coals. She had watched him do it twice and understood the technique and put the coffee on. And when he came down the ladder 20 minutes later and found the fire blazing and the coffee ready, he stopped on the bottom rung and looked at her in the firelight with an expression that was not entirely composed. He said, "You did not have to do that." She said, "I know," and handed him a mug. He sat down at the table and she sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the pre-dawn dark with the storm finally dying outside. She could hear it losing its conviction, the wind dropping from a roar to a steady push, the kind of quiet that comes after something enormous has exhausted itself. She said, "Frank Dewey. Did you ever find him?" He looked at her over his mug. "Yes," he said. She waited. He said, 2 years after Margaret died, he had gone south to New Mexico territory. He was working in a silver camp outside Santa Fe, same work, same pattern, different woman. He paused. "I found him. I confronted him with the evidence of what he had done, letters he had written to Margaret, a witness I had located in Wyoming, a statement from a woman in Santa Fe whose experience of him I had documented. I went to the territorial marshal, and I presented the evidence, and I stayed until the case went to trial." Julia said, "And He said he was convicted of the assault on the woman in Santa Fe. They would not try him for Margaret because Wyoming was a different jurisdiction, and the local marshal there had destroyed the primary evidence years earlier. He received 8 years in the territorial prison. Julia said, 8 years. He said, 8 years. She heard everything in those 2 repeated words that he did not say the inadequacy of it. The way justice in the territories in 1882 was a rough and partial thing that gave you something and withheld the rest and expected you to call the balance fair. She said, but you came back here anyway, after the trial. He said, coming back here was already decided before the trial. The trial was a debt paid, a last thing done before I closed the account. She said the rule was the closing of the account. He said, yes. She said, Aaron, and she used his name for the first time with the directness she used for things she meant completely. You brought me here before the storm when you could have found another solution. You opened that door for me. I think the account is not as closed as you believe it is. He looked at her for a very long time, and she held his gaze with everything she had. All the hard-learned courage of 4 years married to Robert Garrison. All the exhausted determination of October and the stage and the frozen journey north. All the thing that had been growing in her since she sat in his firelight with his book in her hands and felt, for the first time in years, entirely safe. He said, Julia, and stopped. She said, you do not have to say anything right now. He said, I'm not sure I know how to say it anyway. She said, that is perfectly all right. We have time, and looked out the window where the storm was finally dying, the sky beginning to lighten in the east with the gray pearl quality of December dawn in the high mountains, and she thought for the first time since October about the future as something other than escape, as something to move toward. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm had blown itself out, and the ridge was buried in 3 feet of new snow, beautiful and impossible, the pine trees draped in it like figures in white cloaks. Aaron went out at first light to clear the path to the outhouse and the lean-to, and Julia watched him from the window and felt the specific warmth of watching someone you are beginning to love doing ordinary work. The word arrived in her mind without ceremony. Love. She examined it with the caution of someone who has been burned by the word before, who has discovered that the word can be used to justify almost anything and actually mean almost nothing. But this was different, and she knew it was different in the way that you know certain things, not because of evidence, but because of the whole-body certainty that comes from a place below argument. She made breakfast. Cornmeal mush from the dry goods cupboard, fried salt pork, biscuits that she made from memory using flour and lard and buttermilk powder, because Clara Holt had taught her the recipe, and she had practiced it enough times in the past 2 weeks that her hands knew it now. When Aaron came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. She had set 2 plates, 2 forks, the biscuits in a cloth-lined basket, and for a moment something crossed his face that was entirely unguarded that she saw and immediately understood was not about the food. He said, "You did not have to," she said, "I know. Sit down." He sat down. They ate breakfast together. Outside, the winter sun came up over the eastern ridge and turned the snow into something that burned with cold fire, white and gold and so purely, aggressively beautiful that even Aaron Archer, who had lived with this view for 4 years, looked at it through the window with something that might have been gratitude. He said, "The road to town will be passable in a day, maybe 2. When it is, I will ride down and take the measure of your husband's situation." Julia said, "Robert won't have left. He is too stubborn and too furious to leave. He will be waiting." Aaron said, "I know. I am not planning to wait for him to leave. I am planning to give him a reason to go." She looked at him. Said, "I have certain knowledge about the way deputy badges from Denver function outside Denver jurisdiction, which is to say they function very poorly indeed. The county sheriff up here is a man named Hayes who does not recognize Denver authority in his territory and who has in the past escorted visitors who misrepresent their official capacity to the county line personally. I will speak to Hayes," Julia said. "And if Robert doesn't go," Aaron said, Then Hayes will make the point more formally. Julia said, "Aaron, he is genuinely dangerous. He is not a man who responds to official pressure the way most people do. There is something in him that escalates when he feels cornered." Aaron said, "I know the type." He said it simply, without drama, and she understood from the way he said it that Frank Dewey had also been that type, and that Aaron Archer had learned things about that type that he had no interest in discussing and every intention of applying. 2 days later, the road was passable enough for horses, and Aaron rode down to Crested Butte alone, leaving Julia in the cabin with the instructions that the rifle on the leftmost rack was loaded, the secondary bolt on the door was engaged, and that under no circumstances was she to open the door without hearing his voice first. He was gone for 5 hours. In those 5 hours, Julia discovered things about herself that the past weeks had been preparing her to discover. She was not afraid. She had expected to be afraid. Robert's presence in the same general geography had been generating terror in her since she had first heard of it from Clara Holt's kitchen boy. But she sat in the cabin in the mountain stillness and realized that the terror had transmuted into something else. Anger partly, resolution partly, but also the deep structural confidence that comes from knowing that the space you are sitting in belongs to someone who has already chosen your safety over his most fundamental rule, and who rode down a snowed-in mountain road to face your demon on your behalf. She thought about what that meant, what it cost him, what the rule had been for. The rule had been a protective wall around the wound of Margaret, around the unbearable guilt of having believed the wrong person, around the possibility of ever again being someone who could fail to protect a person they loved. Breaking the rule even partially, even in the mechanical sense of opening the door to a stranger in need, had required him to risk reopening something that he had spent 4 years trying to close. He had done it anyway. He had seen her bruised face and her gray-blue eyes and the particular straightness of a woman who is terrified and refusing to show it, and something in him had made a decision that was older and more powerful than the sign on the door. She was in love with him. She admitted it to herself completely, in the afternoon silence of the cabin, and then she got up and started planning dinner because love, she had learned, was most safely expressed in the first instance through practical action. When Aaron came back, he came back differently than he had left. There was something lighter in his posture, something that was not quite relaxed but was less armored than usual, and his dark eyes had a quality of accomplished purpose that she had not seen before. He came in, took off his coat, sat down at the table, accepted the coffee she poured for him, and said, "Robert Garrison left Crested Butte this afternoon at 2 o'clock on the mail wagon heading south toward Gunnison. Sheriff Hayes and 2 of his deputies assisted with the departure." Julia said, "Assisted how?" Aaron said, "Hayes explained in considerable detail that a Denver deputy's authority ended at the Douglas County line, and that representing himself as a law officer while operating outside his jurisdiction in order to harass a private citizen was a matter that Hayes could bring charges on if he chose." Hayes also mentioned that there was a warrant in the Denver County system for a Robert Garrison for aggravated assault of a woman, which is apparently the result of your case before the magistrate that I gather you began before you left Denver. Julia stared at him. "I filed the papers," she said slowly, "before I left. I was not sure the magistrate would act on them." "He acted," Aaron said. "The warrant was issued in November and transmitted to Mountain Territory jurisdictions last week, apparently. Hayes had it. He showed it to your husband. Your husband, upon considering his options, chose the mail wagon." Julia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He will be back." "Not immediately, but eventually. Men like Robert don't give up because of a warrant." Aaron said, "He may try, but there are now 2 things he didn't count on. The warrant and Hayes has long memory." He paused. "There is also the matter of what Elias Webb contributed." Julia said, "What did Elias contribute?" Aaron said, "Elias, it turns out, has spent the last 5 days making sure that every man in Crested Butte with any kind of authority or influence knows exactly who Robert Garrison is and what he has done. By the time Hayes went to speak to your husband this morning, there was not a single establishment in town that would serve him, rent him a room, or sell him supplies. Elias is, as I mentioned, a man who has been waiting for exactly this occasion. Julia felt the pressure behind her eyes that she had been managing for 3 weeks release all at once, suddenly and completely, and she pressed her fingers to her forehead and breathed, and the breath came out ragged, and the one that followed was steadier, and by the third one she was composed mostly, except for the tears that she could not quite prevent from reaching her cheeks. Aaron watched her with an expression that was purely and thoroughly helpless. The expression of a man who is confronted with someone else's emotion and wants very much to do the right thing and is not entirely certain what that is. He said, "Julia." She looked at him. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and it was the first time he had touched her, and she felt it with the whole of her body, the warmth and weight and calloused roughness of his hand over hers, and he said, "You are safe here." She turned her hand over and held his, and she said, "I know." They stayed like that for a long time, his hand in hers across the pine table, the fire building in the hearth, the December dark falling outside the shuttered windows, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying right now, only the enormous, complicated, terrifying fact of two people choosing to be in the same place at the same time, and calling it safety, and calling it something more than that, and knowing that they were only at the beginning of whatever the more than that was going to become. The next week was a gradual, deliberate unfolding. Julia did not move back to Clara Holt's boarding house immediately, and neither of them made a formal statement about that fact. There was, simply and without drama, no compelling reason for her to leave before the Christmas holidays. The road was treacherous. The weather was unpredictable, and the practical arrangements in the cabin had settled into a mutual rhythm that worked with an efficiency that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would require either of them to admit that it was good, and admitting that it was good would require them to consider why it was good. And considering why it was good would require the conversation that they were both circling the way cold water circles a drain inevitably. But not yet. Julia wrote a long letter to Clara Holt explaining her situation and thanking her for the protection she had given. She wrote a shorter letter to the Denver magistrate's office confirming her location and requesting information about the warrant's status and whether the case against Robert could proceed in her absence, which it could under Colorado territorial law, she discovered, if she had filed sworn affidavit, which she had. She also, because she was Julia Garrison, who had been a seamstress before everything else, whose hands needed work the way some people's minds needed argument, asked Aaron if she could make use of the elk hide that had been sitting rolled in the corner of the workroom since before she arrived. He said, "For what?" she said. "You need a second blanket for the loft. The one up there is adequate but not sufficient for the temperature you're going to reach in January. Elk hide, properly scraped and softened, makes an excellent blanket." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "The tools you need are on the third shelf of the workbench. The scraper is the bone-handled one on the left." She made the blanket. It took 4 days of careful work, and by the end of it her hands were rougher than they had been, but the blanket was good, thick and supple. The hide worked to an even softness, stitched at the edges with sinew thread. She laid it on the east side of the loft partition and came back down the ladder, and Aaron looked up from his book and said, with the particular understatement that was his native language, "That is well made." She said, "It is, rather," and sat down across from him and picked up Great Expectations where she had left off, and he went back to his geology, and they read in the firelight, and the pine sap popped, and outside the mountain held the winter in its cold, enormous arms, and inside the cabin there were two people who were becoming, with tremendous care and a precision that matched the precision of everything else in that small, perfectly made space. Something they did not yet have a word for, but that was already unmistakably true. On the 15th of December, Aaron took down the sign from the door. He did it in the morning while Julia was in the loft. She heard the sound, the flat wooden knock of the plank being pulled from its mounting, and came to the top of the ladder and looked down. He was standing with the sign in his hands, looking at it, and then he turned and set it on the workbench face down, and he looked up and met her eyes and said nothing. She said nothing either. But she came down the ladder and stood beside him and looked at the door, which was now just a door, and the morning light came in through the east window and laid itself across the scrubbed pine floor, and the stove was warm and the coffee was hot, and there was nothing on the outside of the door but the natural beauty of the ridge in winter, and the long view down the valley, and the sky that was the particular blue of high altitude in December, which is a blue that has no equivalent anywhere in the world because it is a blue that has not been breathed and has no smoke in it and no city and no history of harm. She said, "Aaron." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I changed the rule." He said it very quietly, and what he meant by it was not just about the sign, and they both knew that. She said, "What is the new rule?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I have not written it yet." She said, "I think it goes something like, the right person may enter." He said, "Something like that." She reached up with her right hand and touched his face, just her fingertips, just his jaw, just the roughness of 2 days' worth of dark beard and the line of his cheekbone under it. And he closed his eyes for a moment the way a person closes their eyes against something overwhelmingly good. And then he opened them and looked at her with everything he had been keeping behind that carefully held door. And it was not small, and it was not simple, and it was not safe. And it was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. He said, "Julia," with the inflection that turns a name into every question that has ever been asked between two people standing this close. She said, "Yes," with the inflection that answers all of them. He kissed her. It was not tentative and it was not rushed. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about this with his full attention for longer than he was yet prepared to admit. And the hand that came up to cup her face was as careful as a man handling something he had found after thinking it was lost forever. And Julia Garrison kissed him back with every atom of everything she had. The courage and the grief and the hope and the hard-won knowledge that safety is not the absence of feeling but the presence of someone worth feeling with. Christmas came to the cabin on the North Ridge with the quality of revelation. Aaron rode down to town 4 days before Christmas and came back with a string of cranberries from Elias Webb's store, which he draped on the branch of a small pine he had cut and set in a bucket near the hearth. He also brought flour and sugar and a small tin of dried fruit and a bottle of French brandy that he set on the table without explanation. Julia made a fruitcake. She made it with the careful precision of someone who is trying to make a thing beautiful in a place where beauty is not expected and is therefore more powerful when it appears. She decorated it with a pattern pressed into the top with the handle of a spoon, a mountain range, small and simple and recognizable. On Christmas Eve, they sat at the table with the fruitcake between them and the brandy poured into 2 tin cups and the small pine tree behind them with its cranberry strand, and a single candle Aaron had rigged carefully in the topmost branch, and the fire going strong, and the world outside clean and cold and white beyond imagining. Aaron said, "I never thought I would spend Christmas with someone again." Julia said, "I never thought I would spend Christmas not being afraid." He said, "Are you not afraid now?" She said, "Not of anything outside this cabin, of things inside it a little. Of how much she paused and then she said it completely, of how much I love you, that frightens me. Not because of what it is, because of what has happened before when I used that word." He set down his cup. He said, "Julia, I need you to understand something about what I feel." He was working toward it with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything, finding the right words the way you find the right tool on a dark shelf by feel, by knowing exactly what you need and trusting your hands to find it. He said, when Margaret died, I thought I had used up whatever capacity I had for that kind of love, that it was finite, like water in a cistern, and I had spent it and the cistern was empty. And I lived as though that were true for 4 years, and it was a perfectly logical way to live, and it kept me from harm, and it also, he started again. It kept me from everything, including things I had not understood the value of until you walked through that door. He looked at her with those dark, completely honest eyes and said, I love you. That is not a complicated statement. It does not come with conditions or fears or the expectation that you return it at the same weight. It is simply and exactly true, and I wanted to say it plainly because I have been a man who said things plainly for 4 years, and I do not intend to stop now. Julia Garrison, who had been holding herself together through the entire speech with the particular composure of someone who knows that if they start crying they might not stop, put her tin cup down and reached across the table and took both his hands in both of hers and held them very firmly and said, I love you too, Aaron. Completely. That is my plain statement. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, and the gesture was so tender, and so completely at odds with the mountain hardness of his hands and the Colorado winter outside, and all the difficulty that had preceded this moment that it broke her open entirely in the best possible way. And they spent Christmas Eve in the firelight in each other's company with the brandy and the fruitcake, and the small pine tree, and the peace that comes when two people who have been through enormous things find, against all practical expectation, that the thing they feared was gone and replaced with something they had stopped believing in, and that the replacement is so much better than what they lost. That gratitude becomes the primary operative emotion. In January, they had the conversation about the future. It was a long conversation. It had several false starts and one significant interruption, when a section of the barn lean-to at the far end of the cabin ridge collapsed under accumulated snow weight and required immediate repair, which they did together, working with the easy physical coordination of people who have been sharing space long enough to develop a shared grammar of motion. Julia handing tools before Aaron asked for them, Aaron holding the structure while Julia positioned the support. Both of them knowing without discussion who needed to do what and when. The conversation resumed at dinner, and it went like this. Julia said she had no intention of going back to Denver. She said the warrant against Robert would be prosecuted in her absence, and that the magistrate had written to confirm this, and that the probability of Robert Garrison ever finding her in Crested Butte again, now that Hayes knew his face and Elia's web had effectively made him persona non grata in every establishment in the county, was extremely low. She said she would need to find permanent work. She could sew, she could cook, she could keep books. She was capable of most things she put her mind to. Aaron listened to all of this and then said, Clara Holt would take you back as a permanent employee, I think, but that would mean moving back into town. He said this neutrally, without pressure, but with the careful attention of a man calibrating what he is allowed to want. Julia said, Is that what you think should happen? He said, I think you should have choices. I think you should not be in a situation where your only option is the one in front of you. She said, Aaron, I am not choosing you because you are the only option. I am choosing you because you are the right one. There is a considerable difference. He said, I have never had a permanent person in this space. She said, You have been having one for 5 weeks. It seems to be going reasonably well. He said, very seriously, better than reasonably well, and she could see him working toward something and she waited for it. He said, I would like to ask you to stay, not as a guest. As he searched for the word and settled on the most direct one, as my wife. If that is a thing you would consider, given that you are currently, technically, still married to someone else. She said, the divorce papers were filed in Denver before the warrant. Colorado territorial law allows a divorce on grounds of physical cruelty with documented medical evidence, and I have documented medical evidence in the form of hospital records going back 3 years. My attorney in Denver believes the divorce will be granted within 6 months. Erin said, 6 months, she said, 6 months, after which I am technically available. He said, I can wait 6 months, she said, can you? He said, I have been living alone on a mountain for 4 years. 6 months is nothing, she said. Then yes, my answer is yes, he said. I have not formally asked yet, she said. Erin, you have been formally asking since the night you picked up the sign from the door. You just used different words. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt. He had put it there 2 days ago. She would learn later, and produced a ring. It was not a jeweler's ring. It was a ring he had made himself from a coin, a silver dollar, hammered and shaped and polished to a smooth band on the stone of the ridge outside, worked in the evenings while she was reading in the firelight and he was supposedly cleaning tack. It had a small design inscribed on the outside, a mountain line, the same mountain line she had pressed into the fruitcake at Christmas, which he had seen and remembered and chosen. He said, Julia Garrison, I am asking you to be my wife. I am asking you to stay in this cabin with me and on this ridge and in this life. And I understand that the life I am offering is not the kind of life that involves social calls and summer fashions and the ordinary comforts of towns, but I will spend every day of it making sure you are safe and valued and told the truth, and I will not stop until I am in the ground, and possibly not then. Julia said, yes. She did not need more time than that. Give me the ring. He slid it onto her finger left hand, the third finger, and it fit, which she decided was either extraordinary luck or evidence that he had been paying considerably more attention to her hands than she had known, which was actually more likely given the kind of man he was. She kissed him, hard and long and without reservation, and he held her in the middle of the cabin floor with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and they stayed like that until the fire needed another log, which was probably the most romantic interruption in the history of the Colorado Rockies. Spring came. With spring came the mud and the snowmelt, and the first green along the creek banks, and the sound of the mountain coming back to life after the long white silence. It also came with the delivery, by the hand of Sheriff Hayes himself, of Julia Garrison's signed and stamped divorce decree from the Denver Territorial Court, which had been granted on the 8th of March, 1883, on grounds of physical cruelty, with a civil protective order attached that named Robert Garrison specifically and permanently. Hayes, who was a practical man with a dry sense of humor, handed Julia the document and said, there is also a note from your attorney saying that Robert Garrison has been sentenced to 14 months in the Denver County Jail for violation of the terms of a prior civil injunction and intimidation of a court witness, which I believe was a neighbor of yours in Denver who testified on your behalf. He paused. He will not be coming back to Crested Butte. I would stake my badge on that. Julia held the divorce decree in her hands and felt not triumph. She had expected triumph, but relief so profound it was almost physical, like setting down a burden she had been carrying so long she had forgotten the weight was optional. She said, thank you, Sheriff. He said, Archer, which was addressed to Erin, who was standing behind Julia. That woman is going to be the best thing that ever happened to this ridge. Congratulations in advance. Erin said, I know, which was not false modesty but simple, accurate assessment. The wedding was held in May in the Crested Butte Church, on a Saturday when the itinerant preacher, a Reverend Calloway, happened to be passing through. It was not a large affair. Elias Webb was there, beaming with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who considers himself personally responsible for the union, which he largely was. Clara Holt was there in her Sunday dress. Sheriff Hayes attended in an official capacity that he defined loosely enough to include consuming considerable quantities of Elias good whiskey. Several of the miners came because news travels fast in a town of 400, and weddings are an excuse for festivity that mining men embrace with tremendous enthusiasm. Julia wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, a deep, warm blue, the color of the mountain sky at noon in March, that she had worked on all through April in the cabin, sometimes at night by lamplight while Aaron read his geology texts, the needle moving steadily through the wool with the competence and focus she brought to everything she made. Aaron wore his good shirt, dark gray flannel, pressed with a flat iron Julia had borrowed from Clara Holt, and a vest he had not worn since Wyoming, which still fit him because he was the kind of man whose size does not shift much with time. And when he came down the loft ladder on the morning of the wedding and saw Julia in the blue dress with her dark hair pinned up and the silver ring on her left hand, he stopped on the bottom rung and looked at her, the way the valley looked in the first morning light after a long storm, with all the amazed relief of something that had endured a great deal and arrived at beauty. Reverend Calloway read from the Book of Common Prayer and asked the relevant questions, and both Aaron Archer and Julia Garrison answered them in clear, direct voices without hesitation or qualification, because they were both people who said things plainly and had decided to say this plainly too. When it was done, and the Reverend said they were husband and wife, Aaron kissed Julia in front of the assembled population of Crested Butte, with a warmth and completeness that caused Elia's web to begin clapping immediately, and the miners to produce a spontaneous chorus of approval that was somewhat rough at the edges but thoroughly genuine. They rode back up to the cabin in the May evening with the first wildflowers blooming along the trail, columbine, yellow and blue, and the early wild rose at the lower elevations, and the creek running high and cold and clear with snowmelt, and the aspens coming back in their first pale green, and the cabin sitting on its ledge of rock with the door open, and the evening light pouring in across the pine floor like something poured from a great height with tremendous care. Aaron had hung new curtains in the main room. Julia had not known about this. She stopped in the doorway and looked at them, white muslin hemmed neatly, hanging in the two south-facing windows and moving slightly in the evening air, and said, "You sewed curtains," he said from behind her. "I hemmed curtains. They were mostly already curtains. The hemming is perhaps not as even as yours would be," she said. "Aaron, the stitching is perfectly even," he said. "I practiced." She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway of his own cabin that was now their cabin, in his gray shirt and his good vest and the last of the May sun on his face, and she said, "I love you enormously." He said, "I am aware. The feeling is mutual." She took his hand and pulled him inside and closed the door behind both of them. Summer on the North Ridge was extraordinary. Julia had expected to find the isolation difficult. She was not, by nature, a person who was comfortable with solitude, and the mountain miles between the cabin and Crested Butte were real and significant in summer, let alone winter. But the isolation was transformed by company. The cabin that had been the enclosure of one man's careful solitude became, with two people in it, something more like a world with edges rather than a prison. She started a kitchen garden in the flat ground south of the cabin, clearing the sod with a mattock and working in the compost Aaron had been building for 2 years without particular purpose. She planted what Elia's web could supply in seeds: carrots, onions, a short-season variety of bean, potatoes, and to both of their delight, a row of calendula that bloomed orange and gold through August like a declaration. Aaron taught her to shoot. This was not a romantic activity exactly, but it was an intimate one. The mornings they spent on the south face of the ridge with the long-barreled rifle, Aaron standing behind her with his arms around her to correct her grip and her stance, his voice close to her ear explaining the mechanics of sight and breath and the relationship between patience and accuracy, which was, she reflected, also a description of the man himself. She got competent quickly. By July she could consistently hit a pine cone at 40 yards, which Aaron acknowledged with the verbal equivalent of a standing ovation, which was, "That is good, try the one on the left." They had a rhythm. Early mornings were his. He was awake before her, and had the fire and the coffee ready when she came down, and she had the quality of being genuinely cheerful in the morning that he found consistently improbable and consistently wonderful. She wrote letters in the mornings, answered correspondence, kept the household accounts in a ledger Aaron had bought her at Elia's store. He went out in the late mornings on the trap lines or down to the creek to check his fish lines or up the ridge to find the things that the mountain was offering up in summer: mushrooms, berries, wild game, the mountain's endless specific bounty. He came back at noon. They had lunch. The afternoons were for projects, the garden, the repairs that summer allowed, the preparation of stores for winter. Evenings were theirs together, reading or talking or simply sitting in the outdoor quality of summer dusk on the south-facing ledge with the valley spread below them in every possible gradation of green and gold. She was happy. The word did not begin to cover it, but it was the word that came to mind first because it was the right shape, not the giddy happiness of inexperience or the performed happiness of social obligation, but the deep, structural happiness of a life that fits, the way a well-made joint fits flush and solid and without gap. She was also by August pregnant. She discovered this, or rather, confirmed what her body had been suggesting for several weeks, via the straightforward evidence of early pregnancy that any woman of 26 with a basic education in physiology could identify. She told Aaron on a Tuesday evening in August when they were sitting on the ledge watching the sunset paint the western peaks in shades that ranged from rose to deep coral to the purple blue of twilight. She said, "Aaron." He said, and turned from the view. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then something happened on his face that she had not seen before, not surprise exactly, because the logical sequence of events that leads to pregnancy was not a mystery to him, but a kind of overwhelmed stillness, the way a man looks when something he has secretly, deeply hoped for turns out to be real. He said, "Are you certain?" She said, "Reasonably certain." Clara Holt has more direct medical experience than I do, and I would like to ride down and speak with her before we call it decided. But yes, reasonably certain. He took her hand. He held it in both of his and looked at it, and then he looked at her and he said, "Julia, is this are you?" She said, "I am very glad, Aaron." "If that is what you are trying to ask." He said, "I am trying to ask everything at once and my language is failing me." She said, "Then I will tell you everything at once. I am happy. I am not afraid. I am exactly where I want to be. And I love you and I love whatever this is going to become." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips and held it there for a long time, and she felt his shoulders release something he had been holding since she had said the words, and she leaned against him in the August dusk on the ridge above Crested Butte, Colorado, in the year of our Lord 1883. And they sat together in the ending of a golden day and the beginning of everything that was going to come next. Clara Holt confirmed the pregnancy with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who has assisted at more births than she has officially counted. She said the baby was due in April, which was good late enough in the winter that the worst of it would be past and early enough in spring that the road would be workable. She also said, with the directness that was her particular form of love, "You will need me here at the birth. Aaron Archer can fix any mechanical thing on this earth, but a childbirth is not a mechanical thing, and the mountain in April is unpredictable. I will come up in late March and stay through the birth." Julia said, "Clara, I would not dream of imposing." Clara said, "You are not imposing. I am informing. I delivered 12 babies in this county and I intend to deliver this one too." That is the end of the discussion. Aaron, who had been listening from the doorway, said, "Thank you, Mrs. Holt." Clara said, "You are welcome, Aaron. Make her eat more. She is too thin for the altitude." Aaron took this instruction with the seriousness he brought to all instructions from people who knew more than he did about a given subject, and commenced the project of ensuring Julia ate more with a systematic efficiency that she found both touching and occasionally maddening. The autumn was beautiful. The aspens went gold in September with the clarity that high altitude gives to the transformation. Not the gradual muting of lower elevations, but a sudden, decisive declaration. The trees turning all at once to a gold so pure it looked manufactured, lit from inside, and the whole ridge above Crested Butte blazing with it. They took the saddlebags down to town for supplies and came back up with the winter stores: flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, coffee, sugar, lamp oil, candles, and the medical supplies that Clara Holt had specified. They put up the last of the garden harvest, Julia canning and Aaron building additional shelf space in the cold pantry at the north wall of the cabin. They split and stacked another season's worth of wood more than usual, because the birth and the subsequent weeks would require sustained warmth. They also, in October, wrote and received a number of letters. Julia wrote to her mother in St. Louis, a tentative, careful letter, because their relationship had been complicated by the marriage to Robert, by her mother's initial approval of Robert and her subsequent inability to acknowledge the mistake. The letter she wrote said, "I am alive and I am safe and I am happy. I have a husband who is a good man. I am expecting a child in April. I would be glad to write to you more if you would like to write back." It was signed with her new name, Julia Archer. Her mother wrote back in November. The letter was imperfect. There was too much apology in it and not enough of the right kind, but it was a letter, and it arrived, and that was a beginning. Aaron wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Gunnison and formally registered the cabin and the surrounding ridge section in both their names. He had been registered as sole holder since 1878. He changed it on a Tuesday in October and showed Julia the letter when it was done, and she looked at it and traced her name, Julia Archer, where it appeared on the document next to his, on the land record of a mountain ridge in Colorado, permanent and legal and real. She said, "When did you decide to do this?" He said, "In January, when I made the ring." She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Aaron Archer, you are a man of extraordinary deliberateness." He said, "I try to do things correctly when I have the time." She said, "You had 6 months." He said, "I used the time well." She kissed him and he kissed her back, and outside the October wind was working through the aspens, and the gold was coming off the trees, and the sky was the high blue of a Colorado afternoon, and the ridge was theirs, jointly and permanently recorded, and everything that had begun with a broken rule and a bruised face in a snowstorm was, leaf by leaf and step by step and day by day, becoming the life. Winter came on in November, deeper and earlier than the previous year. The first big snow hit in mid-November, and by December the ridge was locked in earnest. The trail down to the creek crossing impassable for days at a time after each major storm. The world beyond the cabin reduced to white and pine, and the occasional track of a mule deer crossing the open ground before the tree line. Julia was visibly pregnant by December, and the new weight changed the geometry of her movement in ways that she found intermittently annoying and Aaron found, quite obviously, even more beautiful, though his manner of expressing this was characteristically understated. He built a low stool for the hearth so that she could sit comfortably near the fire while she sewed or read. He adjusted the height of the kitchen worktable by adding 2 inches to the legs because the current height required a bend that put strain on her back. He did both of these things without announcement, the modifications simply appearing one morning as accomplished facts, and when she said, "Aaron, did you raise the table?" he said, "3 months ago your posture at the table was fine. Now it is not. The table needed to change." She said, "You are a very practical man." He said, "I am a man who pays attention." She said, "That is not entirely different from romantic." He said, "No, it is not entirely different." Christmas of 1883 was different from the previous one in that it was larger, not in population, just the two of them as before, but larger in feeling, in the accumulated warmth of a year together, in the small traditions that had established themselves. The cranberry string, which was now supplemented by a garland of pine cones and dried rose hips that Julia had collected in September. The fruitcake, which she had improved upon with the addition of crystallized ginger that Elias had specially ordered for her. The brandy, which was this year a better vintage, a gift from Elias, who considered himself their collective godfather and acted accordingly. Aaron had made her something. He presented it on Christmas morning, a writing box, built from a piece of cherry wood he had ordered from the lumber yard in Gunnison, and worked over the autumn evenings when she was reading. A small, perfect box with a hinged lid lined in green felt and interior spaces, sized exactly for her pen, her ink bottle, and her stationery. On the inside of the lid, inlaid in paler wood, were the letters J.A., her initials, her new name, built into the thing he had made with his hands. Julia opened it and held it in her lap and said nothing for a full minute, which was the longest consecutive silence she had maintained in his presence since the blizzard. And when she looked up, her eyes were bright and she said, "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." He said, "Your stitching on the elk hide blanket was better than my stitching on the felt lining." She said, "Aaron." He said, "Yes." She said, "Accept the compliment." He said, "Thank you. I am glad you like it." She gave him a new geology text. She had ordered it from a Denver bookseller in September, a recent survey of Colorado mineral formations with extensive maps, and watched his face go through the same process hers had. The initial controlled response, the crack in the control, the genuine delight surfacing through. He said, "This is the Hayden Survey Supplement. I have been trying to get this for 8 months." She said, "Elias helped me track it down." He said, "I will thank Elias extensively." She said, "Thank me first." He looked up from the book and his face was completely, helplessly happy, and he leaned across the space between their chairs and kissed her with the certainty and tenderness of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he feels and has decided that the feeling is the best thing available to him, and he intends to honor it accordingly. They spent the day quietly and warmly and entirely well. March arrived, and with it Clara Holt, who came up the trail in mid-March on a stout pony, leading a pack mule with her medical kit and an assortment of supplies, and established herself in the cabin with the calm efficiency of a military commander occupying territory. She inspected the cabin, approved of its cleanliness and the adequacy of its medical provisions, gave Aaron a list of 3 additional items she needed from Elias' store, and told Julia that everything looked excellent and there was no cause for concern, which Julia already knew but found significantly more reassuring coming from Clara. The wait was neither long nor short. It was exactly April the 9th, a Monday, with the first real spring sunshine finding its way through the east window of the cabin and laying warmth on the pine floor that was qualitatively different from the winter light, thicker and more promising. Clara worked with skill and competence and reassuring pragmatism. Aaron was sent to the main room and stayed there for 4 hours in a state of focused stillness that he maintained by splitting a great deal of firewood and restacking the entire lean-to. The baby was born at 2 in the afternoon, a boy, strong-lunged and furious, and immediately, vigorously present in the way of people who intend to take up a great deal of space in the world. He weighed, Clara estimated, somewhere around 8 pounds, which she said was very good. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes, and both of them immediately and simultaneously, the moment they saw him. Aaron came in when Clara opened the door and told him to. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at Julia in the bed, with the baby in her arms, and something in him that had been carrying a 14-year weight quietly put it down and straightened up and breath-free. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Julia put the baby into his arms and he held the boy with the careful, complete attention he brought to every important thing, and the baby looked up at him. The unfocused, absolute attention of the newborn, and Aaron Archer looked down at his son and said, very quietly so that only Julia could hear, "I did not know. I truly did not know it would be like this." Julia said, "I know. Neither did I." He said, "What do we call him?" She said, "I thought James Thomas Archer. Thomas was my grandfather's name." He said, "James Thomas Archer." Yes, he looked at the boy. "James," he said, as though greeting him. The baby made a small, exploratory sound. Clara Holt from the doorway said, He is going to be enormous. Look at those hands." Aaron looked at the baby's hands, the miniature, curled, impossibly perfect hands, and smiled in the full, unguarded way that Julia had been slowly coaxing from him since December and that he now produced more readily, without the careful management of it. The smile that took his whole face and made him look, for a moment, exactly the age he was rather than the age that 4 years of mountain solitude had pressed into him. Summer came again. James Thomas Archer grew at the rapid, enthusiastic rate of the very healthy, and the cabin accommodated him with the same flexibility it had accommodated Julia the previous winter. A crib Aaron built from pine boards with a joinery precision that Clara Holt described as the finest crib she had seen in 40 years, and a small quilt Julia made from the remnants of her blue wool wedding dress, supplemented with flannel from Aaron's worn-out work shirts. The garden expanded. Julia added a third bed and planted marigolds around the perimeter, because she had read that they repelled the insects that damaged beans, and they blazed orange and gold all summer like a recapitulation of the autumnal aspens, and the beans were excellent that year. Elias Webb came up to visit in July with a pretext of delivering a parcel that could have waited perfectly well until Aaron's next trip to town, and held James with the careful delight of a man who has been waiting many years for the occasion to hold someone else's baby, and said, with the slightly gruff sentimentality of a man who takes his feelings seriously but does not parade them, "Garrison, Archer, whatever you are calling yourself, you are going to be just fine." Julia said, "Webb, I was always going to be just fine." He said, "I know, but it is easier to see from here." Sheriff Hayes came up in August with the official notice that Robert Garrison's sentence had been extended by 4 months due to behavior issues within the Denver County Jail, and that the civil protective order had been renewed for an additional 3 years. He delivered this information in the tone of a man presenting good news and accepted coffee and fruitcake, and admired the baby, and told Aaron that the mining company's new pump engine was giving the engineer fits, and asked if Aaron might consult on it when he had a chance. Aaron said he would come down the following week. He did, and diagnosed the pump problem in 90 minutes and fixed it in 3 hours, and the mining company paid him $30, which he brought home and counted on the table, and then looked at Julia and said, "That is enough to build the extension." Julia said, "What extension?" He said, "Off the east wall, a room. A proper room for James when he is old enough for the loft to not be appropriate, and I thought a room in the interim that could serve as your sewing room. You have been doing your sewing at the main table and it is a poor use of the light." Julia said, "You have been planning this." He said, "Since March. I needed the lumber cost confirmed." She said, "Aaron," he said, "you told me before that my deliberateness was not entirely different from romantic." She said, "I stand by that assessment," and kissed him in the kitchen with James on her hip, and the summer light through the south windows was enormous and golden, and the view down the valley was spectacular, and the cabin was warm and full. The extension was built in September, before the leaves turned, with the help of 2 miners who were between jobs and whom Aaron paid in cash and fed well for 3 days' work. It came off the east wall in the sturdy, tight-fitted style of the original cabin, with a good window facing south and a small iron stove for heat, and Julia furnished it with the sewing table Aaron made, a chair, and the curtains she sewed from a length of blue and white checked cotton that she had been saving since July. The first evening she sat in the new room with her sewing in the lamplight, she could hear Aaron reading to James in the main room, one of the Dickens novels, read in the measured cadence he used with everything, his deep voice making the Victorian sentences sound somehow right for a pine cabin on a Colorado ridge, and the sound of James responding to the cadence with the varied vocalizations of a baby encountering narrative for the first time. And she held her sewing in her lap and listened and felt the wholeness of it with every part of her body and her mind and her history. She had been running in December of 1882. Running from a man and a life that had been shrinking her, breaking her down to a smaller and smaller version of herself with systematic efficiency. She had run to the end of the stage line, and then she had walked through a door that had a sign on it saying she was not allowed, and on the other side of that door had been the truest, most complete thing she had ever found. She picked up her sewing and made 12 careful stitches before she heard Aaron close the Dickens and carry James to the crib, and then his footsteps across the main room floor, and then the sound of the sewing room door opening. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his shoulder against the frame and looked at her in the lamplight and said, "He is asleep," she said. "He went down easily," he said. "He was arguing with the narrative. He had opinions about Pip," she said. "He gets that from me." He said, "He gets it from both of us." And he came into the room and sat in the small chair beside her work table and picked up the geology text he had left there that morning and opened it. And she went back to her sewing, and the lamp burned warm and steady, and outside the September wind in the pines was the oldest sound in the world. 2 years passed in the measured rhythm of mountain life, the seasons cycling through their specific demands and offerings, each one bringing something new, each one building on what had come before. James walked at 11 months, ran, essentially, since walking had not captured his interest sufficiently, and spoke his first clear word at 14 months, which was, to Aaron's undisguised pleasure, book, and which caused Elias Webb to declare the boy a genius when informed of this by letter. Julia discovered in the spring of 1885 that she was pregnant again. She told Aaron on a morning in April when the snow was still on the ridge but the creek below was running strong and clear with snowmelt and the first columbine was appearing at the south face. He said, "April seems to be our particular season," she said. "We were both born in spring, so perhaps that makes sense." He said, "Are you well?" she said. "Very well. Better than the first time, actually. I know what is happening." He said, "Good." And then he said, with a slight difference in his voice that she had learned to read as the presence of an emotion he was managing carefully, "I find that I am not afraid this time." She said, "Were you afraid the first time?" He said, "Terrified." "I spent the 4 hours of labor splitting enough wood to heat this cabin for 2 winters." She said, "I noticed the wood pile." He said, "There is a corresponding pile behind the lean-to that is still there." She said, "Aaron, you do not need to be afraid. Clara will come again." He said, "I know. It is not the mechanics I was afraid of. It was the—" He stopped, found the words. "The magnitude of it. The responsibility of a new life in a place that is not gentle. The question of whether I was capable of being what a child needed." She said, "James is not afraid of you for 1 single second." He said, "No. James is afraid of remarkably little, which I think he got from you." She said, "He got his stubbornness from you." He said, "We are in agreement on that one." The second child arrived in November of 1885, earlier than expected, which meant Clara Holt arrived with less advance notice than either of them preferred, but arrived in time, riding up the trail in the first November snow with her medical kit and her unshakable competence. The birth was faster than the first. The baby was a girl. She arrived at 8 in the evening, smaller than James had been but no less vocal about it, with her mother's dark hair and her father's dark eyes, and a quality of absolute determination in the set of her tiny jaw that both Aaron and Julia recognized with the identical thought, "This child is going to be remarkable." They named her Margaret Clara Archer Margaret for the woman Aaron had loved and lost, and whose memory deserved to be carried forward into something living rather than kept only in the old grief of it. Clara for the woman who had made sure both of their children arrived safely in the world. When Aaron told Clara Holt what the middle name would be, Clara said nothing. She looked at the baby for a long moment, and then she looked at Aaron and said, "That is a fine name," in a voice that was very controlled and was therefore completely revealing. James, at 20 months, received his sister with an expression of profound suspicion that gradually, over the course of several weeks, resolved into the proprietary affection of the firstborn toward a smaller sibling. He would stand at the side of the cradle and watch Margaret with intense, cataloging attention, as though she were a geological formation that needed thorough examination before he could form a conclusion. The family that had begun with a broken rule and a blizzard and a man who had decided he was no longer capable of being part of the world had become, on the north ridge above Crested Butte, Colorado, something real and specific and full. The cabin had been extended twice by 1886, the sewing room, and then a second sleeping room off the back for when James was old enough, which he nearly was. The kitchen garden had expanded to 3 substantial beds, plus the herb patch Julia had planted along the south wall, which supplied everything from mint to sage to the calendula that bloomed every summer without fail. Aaron's trapline income, supplemented by the consulting work he did for the mining company through the summers, made them not wealthy but solidly sufficient, the way mountain people define sufficiency, enough for everything that matters, and not so much that you forget what matters. In the spring of 1887, a letter arrived from the Denver magistrate's office confirming that Robert Garrison had served his full sentence and been released, but that the civil protective order remained in effect and had been additionally supported by a statement from Robert's supervising officer indicating that Robert had, during his incarceration, undergone a documented deterioration in health, a heart condition identified by the prison physician, that made sustained travel and the kind of confrontational pursuit he had previously engaged in medically inadvisable. The letter was, in the practical language of the law, an official notification that the threat had substantially receded. The supervising officer had added, in a handwritten note, that in his professional assessment, Robert Garrison was no longer in a position to trouble anyone very much, and would likely be focused on his own survival for the foreseeable future. Julia read the letter at the kitchen table with James playing on the rug behind her and Margaret asleep in the back room and Aaron at the workbench sorting the spring trapline hardware. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at it for a moment. She said, "Aaron." He came to the table. She handed him the letter. He read it. He set it down. He said, "How do you feel?" She said, "I feel like the last door I had been keeping half open has closed." He said, "Is that good?" She said, "It is very good. It is finished. It is the last thing I needed finished." He sat down across from her. He looked at her with those dark, completely attentive eyes and said, "Then we are entirely in the present tense." She said, "We have been in the present tense for a long time." He said, "Now we are in it without anything left behind us that needs resolution." She reached across the table and he took her hand as he always did, with that same first warmth, that first careful grip, the same that had crossed the table in a snowbound cabin when he had said, "You are safe here," the same that was now the most familiar comfort in her life. She said, "Aaron." He said, "Yes," she said, "we built something extraordinary." He looked at the room, the fire, the bookshelves, the curtains in the south windows, the rug on the pine floor, the sound of James talking to himself on the rug, the smell of the herb garden starting up through the cracked-open window, the view down the valley in the spring morning light, and he said, "We did." He paused. "You built it." "I opened the door," she said. "You changed the rule," he said. "I changed the rule," and squeezed her hand, "and I have never for a single moment regretted it." Outside on the North Ridge, spring was progressing with the unhurried confidence of something that has been doing this for millennia and sees no reason to rush. The columbine was coming up at the south face. The creek was running high and musical. The aspen buds were the color of pale jade against the blue sky, and the view down the valley was everything it had always been, large and clear and endlessly specific in its beauty. And the door of the cabin stood open to the morning. No sign on it, no rule on it, just the wide rectangle of spring light and the sound of a family inside it, entirely present, entirely real, entirely and completely home. Later that year, in September, Aaron took down the old pine plank from the workbench where it had been sitting face down since December of 1882. He carried it outside to the south ledge and split it with a single clean stroke of the hatchet and fed it to the fire, and the words that had been burned into it. No one enters went up in the hearth with the complete efficiency of pine in dry autumn, and were gone. He watched it burn for a moment. Then he went back inside to where Julia was nursing Margaret and James, was demanding that someone read him the part of Great Expectations where Pip meets Miss Havisham, which was his current favorite section, and had been for 3 weeks. And Aaron sat down in his chair with the book in his hands, and his family around him in the firelight, and read, in his measured, careful voice, the words of a story about a boy who thinks he knows what love is, and has to learn it the hard way. And the evening came on over the ridge in the gradual, golden, entirely unhurried way of autumn evenings in the Colorado mountains, and the fire was warm, and the 2 people who had built this life from a rule broken in. A snowstorm held the particular, irreplaceable knowledge that the best things rarely come through the front door, and almost always arrive, instead, through the one you forgot to lock, or perhaps the one you chose, finally, to open. In the spring of 1889, when James was 4 and Margaret was 3, and the cabin had developed the loved, lived-in quality of a place that has known much happiness, Julia found herself pregnant for a 3rd time, and she told Aaron while they were planting the kitchen garden, kneeling in the turned earth in the April sun with the smell of soil and new growth around them. He looked up from the seed row he was drawing with a stick and said, "3rd." She said, "3rd," he said, "the cabin will need the lintel converted." She said, "We can do that in June." He said, "I will need more wood." She said, "Aaron," he said. "Yes," she said, "say something that is not about construction." He sat back on his heels and looked at her in the spring light with the expression she loved best, the open, completely present one, and said, "I am very glad, completely, entirely glad. The construction is how I express that, but the underlying thing is happiness." She laughed, the full, genuine laugh that had been one of the first things he had loved about her, and threw a small clod of garden dirt at him, and he caught it with the reflexes of a man who spent considerable time in the outdoors, and he laughed too, which was a sound that had become, over 6 years of marriage, the most reliable music she knew. The 3rd child arrived in December of 1889, a boy they named Thomas William Archer, William for Aaron's father, who had died the previous year, and who Aaron had written to 3 times in the last year of his life, in the tentative, difficult correspondence of a man trying to repair something that had been broken a long time ago. The repair had not been complete, but it had been something, a few letters, a few true things said at sufficient distance to make the saying possible, and naming the baby for him was the continuation of that effort, which seemed right. Elias Webb, who was 60 now and had handed the general store to his nephew but still lived in Crested Butte, and still considered the Archer family his particular province of affection, came up to see Thomas in January with a gift of good coffee, and a set of tin measuring cups that he said were for Julia's kitchen, and that had, in fact, been ordered from a St. Louis catalog 3 months in advance by a man who was paying close attention. He held Thomas and looked at James and Margaret, who were old enough now to engage him in conversation, which they did with the combined verbal energy of 2 children who had been raised partly on Dickens read aloud, and he said to Aaron, very quietly in the kitchen doorway, "4 years ago I sent a woman up a mountain trail with a man who had a sign on his door that said people were not allowed in." Aaron said, "I remember." Elias said, "I was not entirely sure I was right to do it." Aaron said, "You were." Elias said, "I can see that. I can see it very clearly from here." He looked at the main room where Julia was telling James something that was making him laugh, with Margaret on her hip and Thomas in the cradle nearby. He said, "She is extraordinary." Aaron said, "She is." Elias said, "So are you, for the record. You just make it harder to notice." Aaron said, "I will take that as a compliment." Elias said, "It is the highest kind," and went back into the room to continue being corrected on the finer points of Dickens by a 4-year-old. The years turned. The children grew. James learned to read from the same shelf of books his father had built his interior life from, and added to them prolifically. And by the time he was 8, he had opinions about Darwin that he was not shy about sharing. Margaret developed her mother's gift for making things. She began to sew at 5 with scraps of fabric under Julia's patient instruction, and at 7 she was making small quilts that were, Aaron said, considerably better than his curtain hemming had been. Thomas was the adventurer from the moment he could walk. He was inclined toward the outdoors, following his father on the traplines as soon as his legs were long enough, learning the mountain with the same patient attention Aaron had always brought to it. The cabin expanded twice more, a proper second floor in 1892, when Aaron's consulting work with the mining company had become reliable enough to support the lumber cost, and a covered porch along the south face that became the center of the family's outdoor life from spring through fall. The porch looked out on the valley view that was still, after all these years, inexhaustible in its beauty, and on summer evenings the whole family could be found there, Aaron reading, Julia sewing, the children doing the various things children do when they have both the outdoors and books available and have not yet been forced to choose between them. There were difficulties. Mountain life in the 1880s and 90s was not gentle. A harsh winter in 1890 cost them half the kitchen garden to late frost and required Aaron to work extra weeks for the mining company to supplement their stores. James broke his arm in a fall from the barn extension roof in 1891, and the arm was set by the mining company doctor, who did a competent job and healed straight. Margaret had a fever illness in the winter of 1893 that terrified them both for a week before it broke, the child sweating it out in her bed with Julia at the bedside, and Aaron maintaining the fire with the focused intensity of a man who cannot otherwise express the fear. There were negotiations, 2 people building a shared life in an 800-square-foot cabin that had grown to 1,200, and then to 1,500, still required the ongoing, specific work of 2 people deciding together how to live. There were evenings when they were short with each other from exhaustion and evenings when the isolation pressed on Julia with particular heaviness, and she said so directly. And Aaron listened and then proposed solutions, which was his way. And sometimes the solutions were exactly right, and sometimes they were not what was needed. And she learned to say which was which, and he learned to ask first. They had learned each other completely, in the way that time and proximity and genuine attention allow, not the flattering, incomplete knowledge of early love, but the full, specific, unidealized knowledge of actual lives lived together. Julia knew that Aaron became quieter when he was worried and needed to be asked specific questions before he would share what was troubling him. Aaron knew that Julia needed to say things aloud to understand them fully, and that when she was talking through a problem, it was not a request for solutions. She knew that he was secretly more sentimental than he let on. The evidence was in the things he built and gave, the writing box, the extension, the porch, all of it expressions of love in his particular language of making. He knew that she was braver than she knew, braver than she had been when she walked through his door the first time, but he could still see, occasionally, in certain qualities of light or in certain tones of voice, the woman who had been frightened for 4 years, and when he saw her he said her name and she came back fully to the present. In the spring of 1895, when Julia was 39 and Aaron was 39 and Colorado had been a state for 19 years and Crested Butte had grown to nearly 800 people and had a proper hotel and a school and a town council, they stood together on the south porch of their cabin on the North Ridge on a morning in May and watched the valley below. James was 10 and was in town at the school, which had opened 2 years ago with a teacher who had come from Ohio and who had said, after meeting James Archer, that the boy had the most extensive self-education she had ever encountered in a student his age. Margaret was 9 and was inside the cabin at the kitchen table, making a design for a quilt she was planning. Thomas, 5, was with his father on the porch, sitting on the railing with his boots hanging, watching a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the south face. Julia stood with Aaron's arm around her and looked at the valley and the sky and the specific, irreplaceable quality of this particular morning in May on this particular ridge above this particular place in the world. And she thought about December of 1882, the stage from Denver, the frozen mud of the main street, the carpetbag and the bruised face and the terrible, compressed fear. And she thought about the day she had stood on the floor of this cabin and read the words on the back of the sign Aaron had taken down. And she thought about the ring made from a silver dollar that was still on her left hand, going on 13 years now. Aaron felt her shift of attention and looked at her. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "The rule. I was thinking about the rule." He said, "And," she said, "and how grateful I am that I broke it." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas said something about the hawk. He had spotted a second one, a younger bird joining the thermal, and he was pointing at it with a 4-year-old's urgent authority. Aaron told him what kind of hawk it was, and they exchanged a quick, specific conversation about its hunting behavior that revealed, not for the first time, that Thomas had been absorbing information from his father in the quiet, continuous way of children who are paying complete attention even when they do not appear to be. Then Aaron turned back to Julia and said, "You broke it and I changed it." She said, "What did you change it to? You never did write it down." He said, and he said it with the complete, unguarded smile, "The right person enters and stays." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Below them the valley was full of May light, the kind that has everything in it, the whole year's promise, the long view, the absolute continuation of beautiful things. The hawk Thomas had found was still working the thermal, spiraling upward in the warm air with the effortless economy of something that has learned exactly how to rise. Thomas said, "It is going so high." Aaron said, "Yes." Thomas said, "Can it see the whole mountain from up there?" Aaron said, "It can see everything." Julia looked up at the hawk and then she looked at Aaron, who was looking at it too with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered, which was the quality that had built this life from a pine sign and a snowstorm and a woman who had walked through a door that said she was not supposed to, and had found on the other side of it the truest thing that either of them had ever known. She said, "Aaron." She said, "Thank you for changing the rule." He said, "Thank you for breaking it," and held her closer in the May morning on the ridge above Crested Butte, Colorado, and the valley below them was green and wide and endlessly, stubbornly full of life. And the door of the cabin behind them was open, as it always was now in the warm months. And the sound of Margaret inside at the table was the small focused sound of a child making something beautiful. And Thomas on the rail was narrating the hawk's flight in an ongoing monologue of pure, uncomplicated wonder. And the sky above the mountains was the specific blue of high altitude and spring and everything that has been through the worst of things and is still, remarkably, perfectly, undeniably here.